not only to the inquiry but to the public also, in particular the Scottish public, especially those who have an interest in the work of PHS. It goes without saying that I am very much also speaking to the Scottish COVID-19 bereaved families for justice, who have such an important place in this inquiry. It is our hope that what I say today is helpful to all of those with an interest in PHS. I want to say something now about PHS, the organisation. Public Health Scotland is what's termed a special health board and is the lead national organisation in Scotland for improving and protecting the health and well-being of Scotland's population. It was created after a public health reform programme in Scotland, which was designed, amongst other things, to strengthen national leadership in public health. The organisation draws upon a range of expertise within its staff to deliver these objectives, including healthcare consultants, nursing staff and healthcare scientists. Health, social care policy and funding, including public health policy, are devolved matters. This means that PHS operates in a different context to its counterparts in the other UK nations. PHS is committed to helping the inquiry navigate the complexities that this will inevitably create for a UK-wide investigation. In terms of its relationships with others, PHS is accountable to both Scottish Government and local government, reflecting the fact that public health in Scotland is viewed as a shared endeavour of both local and national government. Indeed, PHS is uniquely sponsored by Scottish Government and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, COSLA, on behalf of local government. On a day-to-day level, PHS collaborates across public and third sectors. It's important to note that PHS is a relatively young organisation. It came into existence legally in December 2019, becoming operational on 1st April 2020 at around the start of the pandemic and at the time of the first UK-wide lockdown. It will be apparent that, consequently, during the period with which this module of the inquiry is concerned, PHS was not operational. Responsibility for protecting the Scottish public from infectious diseases and environmental hazards fell to a different organisation, Health Protection Scotland, or HPS for short. When PHS was created, many of the staff and functions of HPS were transferred over to PHS. Moreover, it's important to understand that because of the pandemic, at the time of PHS's launch, there required to be a rapid rethinking of a number of plans in relation to the organisation which had been put in place over a number of years previously. It's fair to say that the organisation faced a number of coalescing and difficult challenges at that time. Despite the pressure of being very much on the front line of the nation's response to dealing with the pandemic, in September 2020, PHS published a 3-year strategic plan setting out its goals for Scotland, focusing on 4 cross-cutting areas: COVID-19, community and place, poverty and children, and mental well-being. The original strategy was strengthened in November 2022 with the publication of a new 3-year plan. This plan built on the 2020 strategic plan and set out PHS's purpose as Scotland's national public health body: to lead and support work across Scotland to prevent disease, prolong healthy life and promote health and well-being. PHS's publicly stated values include respect, collaboration, innovation, excellence and integrity. PHS undertakes that going forward, it will continue to do everything in its power to assist the inquiry with its work in whatever way it can. It will endeavour to approach the inquiry with openness, respect and candour, underpinned by a genuine desire to learn and do better. As a public body, PHS understands the responsibility it owes, not only to the inquiry, but to the people of Scotland, and it will do everything it can to meet those responsibilities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And now I think it's Mr. Hill.
My lady, I represent the Government Office for Science. It is right to acknowledge at the start of this inquiry the enduring loss suffered by those affected by the pandemic. Those bereaved as a consequence of COVID-19, those who were separated from their loved ones and were not reunited, those who continue to live with the life-altering effects of long COVID. It is also right to acknowledge the wider public who took their own altruistic steps to counter COVID-19, those who volunteered for clinical trials, those who supported vulnerable people during lockdown, those who curtailed their own lives and businesses to help protect others. The Government Office for Science and the current and former Government Chief Scientific Advisors for whom we speak wish to commit publicly to what we understand to be the common goal of those participating in this inquiry, to examine what happened in order to inform and improve the country's collective response to future pandemics. In these brief opening remarks, we thought it may assist to deal with two topics. First, an overview of what the Government Office for Science and SAGE are, and perhaps just as importantly, what they are not. And second, an outline of the work that has been done to learn lessons from the pandemic and some of the themes that have been identified in that work. Turning to the first of these topics, the Government Office for Science, GoScience as it's known, is a small organisation. At its head is the Government's Chief Scientific Advisor, the GCSA, who reports to the Cabinet Secretary. Together, GoScience and the GCSA provide science advice to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and promote and support the provision of science advice in all government departments. During government-wide emergencies, GoScience convenes and provides secretariat support for SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. SAGE is generally chaired by the GCSA. During the pandemic, it was co-chaired by Sir Patrick Vallance, then GCSA, and the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty. SAGE is not a permanent standing committee, and it does not have members. It exists only when it is activated by COBRA in response to an emergency. Its role is to bring together experts relevant to that emergency to inform science advice in a way that is coordinated, comprehensive, and comprehensible. Those who participate in SAGE and its subgroups are experts drawn from across the country, from inside and outside government. Those who attend give independent advice, their analysis drawn from their expertise and experience. It is important to note a few key points. First, GoScience, the GCSA and SAGE are not the only formal sources of science advice to government, even during an emergency. Different government departments lead on different areas, which are related to their own work and expertise. As we have heard, for pandemic planning, the Department of Health and Social Care is the lead department and draws on its own network of scientists, clinicians, public health experts, and so forth, to inform its work. Most government departments have their own chief scientific advisors and their own structures and processes by which science advice is provided internally to senior civil servants and ministers. Organisations such as the United Kingdom Health Security Agency provide operational science and advice. SAGE and the GCSA do not, could not, and would not wish to establish a monopoly on science advice. Second, the GCSA and SAGE do not make policy. They provide evidence and advice to policymakers who weigh it against other sources of evidence and advice: economic, legal, ethical, political, and on occasion national security advice, in order for policy decisions to be made. In our democratic system, elected politicians make those decisions, and in making them are accountable to Parliament and to the electorate. During the pandemic, at Sir Patrick's insistence, SAGE published its minutes and its papers. Other areas of advice were not made public and thus were not subjected to the same level of debate and scrutiny. A potential consequence of SAGE's transparency may be that the science advice arising from SAGE was given particular prominence in the minds of the media and the public in relation to policy. It was, of course, an important input, but it was never the only consideration, nor should it have been. Third, the GCSA and SAGE are not responsible for the operational delivery of science, for example, establishing a testing programme, nor are they responsible for the way in which the science advice is implemented in practice, for example, putting in place procedures to lessen the risk of infection in schools, hospitals, or care homes. Those matters fall to other departments and other organisations. Fourth, the processes I have described are intended to deal with all aspects of science advice in government at all times. It must not be forgotten that most of the work of the GCSA and Go Science relates to a wide variety of non-emergency matters. Further, the pandemic was atypical even for an emergency situation and was unprecedented in its duration. There were 105 SAGE meetings over 2 years. The most previously was 22 over 7 months. The scale and duration of the response posed challenges and, at points, revealed vulnerabilities in the way in which SAGE and Go Science operated. That brings me to the second topic, lessons learned. The work of the GCSA and Go Science on critical self-examination and challenge began at the early stages of the pandemic. In April 2020, Professor Sir Ian Boyd was invited to observe SAGE meetings in order to provide the chairs with feedback on groupthink, optimism bias, and other matters. This was followed shortly after by a review undertaken by Sir Adrian Smith, now President of the Royal Society, at the request of the then GCSA. These were the first of many reviews, all of which are set out in the witness statements provided to the inquiry. The work is ongoing in the form of the SAGE development programme, which is designed to embed the lessons learned in ways of working. A number of documents, papers and reports touching on a wide range of matters have been produced and brought to the inquiry's attention. 2 may be considered to be of particular significance. The first is the technical report of the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK, published on the 1st of December 2022, but was produced by the Chief Medical Officers and others, including Sir Patrick. The second is the 100 Days Mission, a document produced under Sir Patrick's leadership as part of the UK's presidency of the G7, which addressed the specific question of how to accelerate the discovery and development of diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics. Go Science will listen carefully to the evidence that is adduced, and that evidence and your ladyship's reports will inform its further work. It maintains an open mind. It may be helpful, though, to share some of the initial observations that have emerged from the work undertaken to date. This is not intended as an exhaustive list, and it is restricted to matters relating to science and science advice, rather than a wider assessment of factors that affect the course of a pandemic. First, the existence of SAGE and its subgroups was beneficial to the UK's response. Not every country had an equivalent of SAGE, and many of those that did not sought to emulate it. Second, while there may be an argument to establish equivalent advisory groups on matters such as economics, SAGE should continue to concern itself only with science. It would be better for SAGE and any additional groups to convene separately and present their distinct outputs to politicians and decision makers. It is for them, and not the experts, to weigh the competing factors against one another, make the trade-offs, and come to decisions on policy. Third, those scientific areas in which the UK was strong going into the pandemic were those in which it did well. The quality and breadth of its science base, expertise in genomic sequencing, expertise in pharmaceuticals and vaccines, and the ability to mount large-scale national clinical trials. Conversely, areas of national weakness led to vulnerability. The absence of a major domestic diagnostic industry and difficulties in scaling up the manufacture of diagnostics. The underlying health inequalities and comorbidities within the UK population. The lack of excess capacity in the NHS, even in normal times. And challenges in scaling and operations of the public health infrastructure, which raise questions about the investment made in that system in preceding years and whether it had responded effectively to previous pandemic threats. You have heard from others the need to address weaknesses. We agree, and would add that there is also a need to maintain strengths, including advances made during the pandemic. Fourth, and related, access to reliable and relevant data is critical in responding to a pandemic, or indeed any major emergency. Initially, this was an area of weakness. Data were not available, or were not shared, or could not be collated and analysed rapidly. This hampered advice and resulted in underinformed decisions. This weakness was addressed, and data collection, usage, and presentation improved markedly. A central question for this inquiry, and for society as a whole, is to determine which data will be required in the event of an emergency, how they can be shared, and how to establish and maintain structures to achieve this. Your Ladyship will see that these observations reflect the three themes of the 100 Days mission: timely and continued investment in research and development, maintaining capacity and best practice by embedding it in everyday work, and agreeing in advance the rules of the road, for example, on which data is to be shared and how. These do not purport to be an entire answer to how to prepare for a pandemic, but they are a necessary starting point. Finally, it would not be right to conclude without acknowledging the extraordinary efforts of the many scientists, academics, and clinicians who assisted SAGE and its subgroups. The workload was formidable and the pressure intense. They stepped forward voluntarily and at considerable cost to personal and family lives. They did so not for personal advancement or financial gain, but to help. Their work saved many lives, and the country was fortunate to be able to call upon them. Unless I can assist further, my lady, that's
No,
our
you've been
end.
very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Hill. Right, now I think it's Miss Scolding.
I shall just wait, my lady, for the
Waiting for
lectern,
the- yes,
the
the
passing
lectern.
of the lectern. Good morning, my lady. I appear together with Mr. Stein KC, and we represent the Department of Health and Social Care in this inquiry. We wish to start by expressing our heartfelt condolences and deepest sympathies to all the families who have lost loved ones to this pandemic, had their lives disrupted, and who have suffered the after effects on both their mental and physical health. The pandemic touched every family in the nation, and in many cases brought change, losses, or absences which can never be fully repaired. The department recognises that the guidance it put in place often meant that family and friends were unable to see their loved ones for long periods of time, causing profound loneliness, pain and anguish, the effects of which still endure for many today and were so powerfully reminded to us by the accounts given in the video yesterday. In particular, people were unable to visit and comfort loved ones who were unwell or dying, and were unable to undertake the important rituals surrounding death, which are so vital for catharsis and expressing a shared grief. Not being able to attend and say goodbye at a family funeral was a nightmare for so many of us. The stoicism and forbearance shown and the sacrifices made by so many will never be forgotten. The department also wishes to thank each and every person working within its own staff, in health and social care, in hospitals, care homes, and in the community, in public health bodies, in local government, in the armed forces, in charities and the voluntary sector, as well as the hundreds of thousands of family carers who sought to keep their loved ones safe at considerable cost to their own physical and mental health in very many cases. The dedication and compassion shown by these individuals at very short notice and the efforts they made to provide comfort and support were nothing short of heroic, and we salute them. We must also thank each and every person who changed their behaviour to protect those who are most at risk of being affected by the pandemic. The advice the department gave and the measures it was required to recommend needed the consent of the population. Everyone who stayed at home, often to the detriment of their mental health, their financial health, their education, and their personal and professional relationships, helped keep us all safer. Without this agreement, many more people would have lost their lives. The resilience, determination and swift response by the population made a tremendous difference. The aim of the department and those working in it was at all times to save lives, minimise serious illness and protect health and care, particularly during the first 6 months of the pandemic, when less was known about the virus and its transmission. There was frequently a need to issue guidance or create policies where there were, in reality, no good options. The department recognises the strength of feeling amongst some that certain of the decisions made by us were wrong. For example, some people feel that lockdown should have been introduced earlier and for longer. Others hold an opposite and contrary view. What the department was often faced with were a choice between a series of hugely unpalatable options, all of which were certain to have negative impacts on the citizens of the United Kingdom in one way or another. Decisions were often extremely finely balanced. Contrary decisions could rationally have been made, resulting in a very different set of outcomes. The department will not seek, during the course of this inquiry, to say that it did everything right or that it would necessarily have made the same decisions today in 2023 with the benefit of hindsight. We will, however, propose that it is necessary to recognise that the context of the time, particularly in respect of pandemic preparedness, was very different to what we know now, and would ask you, my lady, not to impose what we shall call a retroscope upon decision-making. COVID-19 has not gone away. The department and all of those providing health and social care in Britain are still fighting it, even though effective vaccines and treatments mean that its impact is very much reduced. There are new variants which require further work to be undertaken, and people are still becoming ill, sometimes seriously. Those with clinical vulnerabilities are also leading more restricted lives in some cases. The after effects of COVID are profound on the mental and physical health of the nation, as I've mentioned, and not least on those whose treatment may have been paused for other diseases and illnesses because of the pandemic. The job of the department is to remain vigilant and to keep caring for those who require it. I shall not, my lady, be setting out a detailed framework of the Department of Health and Social Care, to which I have no doubt many people shall be relieved. Our role is predominantly to support ministers to help people lead more independent, healthier lives for longer. Its job is to set in place the framework so that our NHS can function and deliver exceptional healthcare to the population, and to provide care services for the most vulnerable in our society. The organisational framework for delivering such is complex and dispersed amongst a large number of bodies in central government, in arm's length bodies related to central government, in local government, in charitable, voluntary and for-profit organisations. At the time of the pandemic, for example, there were 152 local authorities, 213 hospital trusts, 191 clinical commissioning groups, 34,000 general practitioners, and around 25,800 registered adult social care establishments, by which I mean both domiciliary, i.e. non-residential, and residential services. The demands on both health and social care services have increased greatly over the past 20 years as people live longer and breakthroughs in treatment and technology enable those with disabilities to thrive in an ever broader range of activities. Seeking to manage and provide guidance, support, equipment, services and policies during the pandemic was a Herculean task and was the greatest challenge ever faced by the NHS and the adult social care sector. You will hear the department referring to various documents as battle plans or operations, precisely because it was an all-consuming period akin to a war, and mobilisation was required in every organisation in the United Kingdom and with every person. We approach this inquiry with humility. We know that there are valuable lessons to be learned. We are open-minded to learn what others say about our processes and procedures, both before and during the pandemic, and the decisions we took. By the end of 2020, everyone was thoroughly sick of the word unprecedented, but that is the most accurate description of what happened. This module is dealing with the plans that were put in place in advance of that period of time. Before the pandemic started, they were regarded by various international bodies as world-leading. Some of those plans did help during the pandemic, and our evidence to this inquiry points out where that is the case. An obvious example was the work which had been undertaken following the Ebola outbreak in 2015 to put additional money into vaccine research, and the setting up by the previous Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, of the National Institute for Health Research, which brought together and aided research funding, again enabling a vaccine to be developed quickly by the UK scientists. Operation Cygnus, which was the exercise you heard about yesterday, undertaken in 2016 about planning for a flu pandemic, was also instrumental, as it allowed the United Kingdom to have draft legislation which was then easily adapted for use during 2020. However, the department does wish to identify areas where in particular it has sought to learn from what went well and also what did not go well in respect of preparedness, to enable it to prepare better for future pandemics and other catastrophic risks to the nation's health and well-being. These are best encapsulated by the following 5 issues. First, we need a toolkit of capabilities which can adapt to deal with whatever public health risk emerges, rather than a fixed plan against specific threats or viruses. Plans are important, but they are only as good as the core capabilities upon which they are based. This is the case for all measures which need to be taken during pandemics. For example, the provision of scientific advice, research, surveillance and data, the development of vaccines, diagnostics, testing and therapeutics, the system of regulation of medicines and medical products, stockpiles of medicines, vaccines and other material, including PPE, the maintenance of manufacturing capacity for testing, therapeutics, PPE and other pieces of equipment and medicine, which is cited within the United Kingdom, and a legislative framework to enable actions to be implemented swiftly. Areas where the UK has relative strengths performed well during this pandemic. Where there was weakness or fragility, the response was not as good. Secondly, the underlying resilience of the health and social care system really matters, because a strong system of public health and social care is needed to fight future risks effectively. Indeed, a resilient system, limited health inequalities and a generally healthy population will be more likely to be able to cope with shocks of any kind. Levels of core capacity for day-to-day health and care services, which must be resilient, need to include specialist laboratories which can be expanded to meet demand rapidly, NHS general, critical and intensive care beds with bed occupancy levels at a sustainable level, and appropriate and safe staffing. There is also a need for social care services both at home and in residential settings to maintain a high level of built-in resilience, for there to be a good pipeline of medical supplies and for a workforce with the experience and numbers to cope. The underlying health of the population and health inequalities also matter in the ability of our country to respond to new health threats. For example, the increasing age profile, levels of obesity, smoking, or pre-existing comorbidities. Third, any pandemic planning must include the ability to surge and scale up quickly in the first few months. Planning for preparedness and response capability in the future must address areas which have to be prepared in advance. For example, stockpiles of antivirals, stockpiles of therapeutic measures, stockpiles of PPE, whilst we learn more about the disease and start to develop specific medical countermeasures. Planning must also consider provision in areas where an immediate response is required. For example, the ability to buy disease-specific vaccines or to establish large-scale trials very quickly. We need to consider how we cope in the first few months of a pandemic so that our resources can be mobilised effectively and scaled up to meet the country's needs. Fourth, diagnostic surge capacity was a particular weakness in the past pandemic. The initial scientific and technical responses by way of genomic sequencing of the virus and the development of the test was good, reflecting our exceptional scientific community's hard work and collaboration. Our end position of being able to provide over 1 million tests a day was amongst the best in the world, but it was very difficult to scale up testing in the first stages of this pandemic to the number and speed required, and it was an area of significant weakness compared to our international competitors and comparators. Fifth, pandemic preparedness in the future should take account of and be responsive to all 5 routes of transmission of communicable disease: respiratory, touch, oral, blood, or by vector, for example, an insect. COVID-19 and flu are both respiratory diseases. The last major pandemic within the UK was HIV, which was sexually transmitted and required a very different response. And unfortunately, there is still no effective vaccine for it. We need, as Professor Van Tam infamously said, very many shots at the goal the next time round. We must recognise that future pandemics will be unexpected and will present new challenges. We need to be prepared for the worst by maintaining the resources and core capabilities that underpin a resilient health and care system and a healthy population, alongside contingency arrangements to scale up quickly. The Department recognises that the role of the government is not just to ensure that the UK is prepared, but also to assist other countries with pandemic preparation and support, including surveillance, therapeutics and vaccines, to limit the spread of future diseases. This is not entirely altruistic, but must be seen as part of the strategy to protect the United Kingdom. Finally, the Department is well aware that many will argue that extra resource in health and care is part of the answer to improve pandemic preparedness. It is this Department's role to advise on strategies and policies to help, as I have already said, people live more independent, healthier lives for longer, and to deliver health and social care support that they need in a way which is of the highest quality, efficient and cost-effective. It is, however, the job of the government as a whole to make and implement decisions on the level of resourcing, balanced against competing demands from other departments. In this regard, fiscal and economic resilience will always be vital to the country's ability to resource the needs of its citizens, both in ordinary life and in future crises of this nature. In short, the Department welcomes the work of this inquiry, recognises its importance in shaping future preparedness and in assessing the numerous decisions taken in meeting the demands of the COVID pandemic. The Department is here to assist with the work of the inquiry in whatever way we can, and the Department is committed to making sure that this country is ready to face the challenges presented by any and all future diseases. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Kinnear? Short transfer that time.
My Lady, good morning. I appear on behalf of the Welsh Government before you today. The pandemic touched the lives of everyone, but none more so than those who lost loved ones. As was so powerfully demonstrated in yesterday's Impact film, the bereaved are rightly seeking an answer to the question which lies at the heart of this module. Were the governments of the United Kingdom adequately prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic? The question is one that requires a timely answer, and it is a significant achievement of this inquiry that Module 1 has been brought so swiftly to a hearing. The scale of the preparation by the inquiry team and the core participants is considerable, and it bodes well for the efficient completion of the hearings in line with the timetable you have recently announced. As Mr. Keith's opening statement illustrated, the question about the adequacy of this country's preparedness will not be a straightforward one to answer. Much turns on an assessment of structures, policies and procedures in the four nations, and although they shared some institutional arrangements and framework strategies and policies, such as the UK's 2011 pandemic influenza strategy, there were material differences between them all and their application by the devolved governments. Much will also depend upon whether the assessment contained in the UK National Risk Register that pandemic influenza was the greatest risk confronting the country was reasonable. In addressing the question whether the UK was adequately prepared, the Welsh Government has cooperated fully with the inquiry and will continue to do so. Scrutiny may sometimes be difficult, even uncomfortable, but it is necessary. That is because fair but unsparing scrutiny is vital to make sure that the four nations of the United Kingdom are best prepared for any future health emergency. The Welsh Government made clear at the outset that it would play its full part in helping and supporting the inquiry's work. To that end, in addition to giving very significant disclosure, the Welsh Government has provided 18 statements in Module 1 alone. 5 statements came from present ministers, including the First Minister of Wales and former ministers, and 13 were given by past and present senior officials. Their statements answer the questions that the inquiry asked, and each and every one of the makers of those statements is ready to help your work further. Indeed, a number have been called to give oral evidence in due course. As you know, the Welsh Government statements address in detail the resilience and preparedness structures in Wales, the NHS in Wales, and its links to preparedness and resilience, and the provision of scientific, technical and medical information in Wales. Those matters were addressed at length as well as the inquiry's questions about what was considered to have worked well in relation to preparedness, and equally what was thought not to have worked well. The detail of those views will surely be considered further in examination. The Welsh Government did not wait for the inquiry's call for evidence and hearings to examine what had worked and what did not work before the first wave of the pandemic started to retreat. In June 2020, the Welsh Government started critically to examine its own response and to identify recommendations for improvement. The resulting analyses have all been disclosed to the inquiry. Undoubtedly, the conclusions of those analyses will inform Counsel to the Inquiry's examination of Welsh Government witnesses and your report in due course. The inquiry's work may also be assisted by the work of others who have analysed the substance of the Welsh Government's response to the pandemic. For example, parliamentary consideration of the Welsh Government's response by the various committees of the Senedd, reviews by Welsh regulatory bodies such as Estyn, the Inspectorate of Education and Training in Wales, Health Inspectorate Wales, the Care Inspectorate Wales, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and finally audit work carried out by the independent body Audit Wales, particularly in relation to PPE. The inquiry will undoubtedly examine Welsh Government witnesses on the substance of the lessons learned from its responses to the pandemic and what they may say about the strengths and weaknesses of preparedness arrangements in January 2020. One theme which emerges from the evidence is that those arrangements provided a useful foundation for the Welsh Government's response. That said, when the pandemic started, adaptability and flexibility were required of decision makers and all those responsible for carrying out the response. The inquiry will examine whether the degree of adaptability and flexibility that was required could, or indeed should, have been reasonably anticipated before. The inquiry will also rightly shine a light on the extent to which detailed consideration was given to the impact of the pandemic and the response on health and other inequalities. Although the general impact on vulnerable persons was considered, it is fair to say that more detailed work could have been done to identify the particular effect of a pandemic and its response on those with particular health or impairment issues, as well as broader socio-economic inequalities. One important point that Mr. Keith drew out yesterday is the broad question of resilience. That is to say, the country's ability to respond to and to recover from a whole system emergency such as COVID-19. It is much more than an analysis of structures, policies and procedures, although they are important. It is concerned with whether the country has invested sufficiently, both in terms of people and resources, to weather and recover from an emergency such as the pandemic. The Welsh Government's evidence makes clear that a central element in its view of Wales's resilience was the policy of steadily increasing investment in the Welsh NHS in the years before 2020, and in an environment where austerity significantly limited the available funding. That important point of context will be a significant feature in the assessment of preparedness. Another feature of resilience was the well-established and effective working relationships that had developed between the Welsh Government, local health boards and Welsh local authorities in the years before the pandemic, as was reflected in the Welsh Local Government Association submissions yesterday afternoon. Those good working relationships were an essential and necessary feature of effective preparedness, and they greatly assisted the response to the pandemic in Wales. That too may be an issue that will be explored in due course. The inquiry's investigation in Module 1 is rightly alive to the overarching political context in which the adequacy of preparedness will come to be assessed in the years before 2020. A significant and arguably the dominant factor of that context will be the preparations for the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, and in particular, the planning for a no-deal exit. The extent to which Brexit-related preparation and planning consumed the attention of all four governments in the UK from 2017 onwards cannot be underestimated. It is clear that Brexit preparations were the reason why the work of the UK's Pandemic Influenza Review Board was substantially paused in 2018. That said, it is also clear that preparations for a no-deal departure required both ministers and officials to consider the consequences of a whole system emergency, work which bore fruit when the pandemic struck. My lady, may I finally turn to the question of recommendations? A fundamental part of this inquiry's work is the formulation of efficient and effective recommendations that put right any deficiencies or flaws that are found to exist. The inquiry provides an invaluable forensic context in which to identify and analyse the merits of proposed measures. My lady will know better than most from her experience following the 7/7 bombings that some proposals may, at first blush, seem attractive or indeed consistent with a perception of common sense, but which on analysis are found to be unlikely to address the identified problem effectively, or indeed transfer the risk elsewhere, or maybe even heighten that risk. Consideration of recommendations may not therefore be a straightforward exercise. How the inquiry will identify and consider them will be an important feature of your work in which the Welsh Government stands ready to help. At this stage, one matter which the inquiry may wish to consider is whether, and if so to what extent, intergovernmental arrangements for the sharing and commissioning of expert advice may be improved. Some institutional reforms have already been implemented, primarily addressed at enhancing the nature and quality of intergovernmental liaison between the heads of government of the four nations. However, the clear and consistent evidence is that Welsh Government was unable to draw more directly upon the UK Government's very considerable and comparatively greater expert scientific resources so as to better inform their own decision-making. My lady, in conclusion, we come before you recognising that there will be lessons to be learned in relation to preparedness. Finally, thank you for the work that you and your team have already undertaken and for the very much more substantial work that is to come. The Welsh Government will continue to assist inquiry in any which way it can.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I think we have Mr Mitchell for the Scottish Government. This is lectern handing, very well planned.
Good morning, my lady. I appear at these public hearings on behalf of the Scottish Government. I appear along with my juniors, Fiona Drysdale and Jennifer Nicholson-White, and we are instructed by Caroline Beattie of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. My theme this morning is one of commitment. Commitment to the Chair, to the inquiry process, and to the people of Scotland. That commitment is to assist and to cooperate with the inquiry, to listen to the evidence and to learn lessons that might flow from that evidence. Before going any further, on behalf of the Scottish Government, I would like to recognise the loss suffered by the people of Scotland and the wider UK population during the pandemic. Everyone suffered and many thousands lost their lives. That loss is felt, understood and acknowledged by the Scottish Government. Indeed, how could it be otherwise? The people of Scotland are resilient. They responded to the challenges of COVID-19, and together Scotland emerged from the pandemic. Yet the cost was high. Certain sections of Scottish society suffered more than others. Legitimate questions arise as to whether the suffering needed to have been quite so great. The continuing goal of the Scottish Government is to build a resilient Scotland that is able to protect all its citizens from risks that emerge to threaten the safety of modern-day society. Therefore, let me repeat one of the commitments that I have already given. The Scottish Government comes here to listen and is eager to learn how its processes, structures and policies on preparedness could be improved. Let me say something about Scotland's resilience system, which Mr Keith touched on briefly yesterday. The Scottish Government has taken an approach over many years to build resilience capacity to deal with any risks faced by the country, including preparing for a pandemic. The Scottish Government approached pandemic risks in the way that it approached any risk. Often, it prepared in partnership with the UK Government and other devolved administrations on what is sometimes called a four nations basis. It may be helpful if I take some time here to set out, in brief terms, the resilience system as it exists in Scotland. In general terms, the development of resilience in Scotland has focused on consequences, not causes. In other words, an all-risks approach is adopted, whereby planning can be adapted readily to fit a wide range of issues. Within the Scottish Government, there are, broadly speaking, two functions to preparedness. The first is a central managerial function. Here, a central resilience division of Scottish Government works with different branches of the government and public bodies to assess a whole range of risks, whether that be a risk of flooding or a risk of terrorism. In the case of the assessment of a pandemic risk, there is close cooperation between the resilience divisions, the Health and Social Care Department of Scottish Government, and NHS boards. Should an incident or emergency arise, Scottish Government Resilience Room can meet to coordinate and direct actions designed to respond to the incident. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Resilience Room met on a regular basis and a frequent basis and was often chaired by either the First Minister or the Deputy First Minister. The second function supports the development and delivery of the plans that deal with risks and emergencies. This is underpinned by the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, of which we have already heard. That seeks to minimise disruption in the event of an emergency and to ensure that the UK is better prepared to deal with these emergencies. Whenever there is an emergency in Scotland, different organisations work together to tackle it. Depending on the nature of the incident, this might include Police Scotland, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, health boards, or local authorities. These organisations form something called a resilience partnership, which structure allows them to coordinate, collaborate, and to share information. The structure which supports multi-agency coordination is the Regional Resilience Partnership. There are 3 regional resilience partnerships in the north, in the east, and in the west of Scotland. Within each regional partnership sits several local resilience partnerships, the composition of which are determined by the regional partnerships. The regional partnerships and the local partnerships bring together all the relevant organisations in an area to develop an effective approach in dealing with emergencies. Also supporting the second function of development and delivery is the Scottish Resilience Partnership. This is a core group of the most senior statutory responders and key resilience partners. The group acts as a strategic policy forum for resilience issues, providing assurance to ministers that statutory responders and key resilience partners are aware of any significant resilience gaps and priorities and that they are addressing these. It provides advice to the resilience community on how best to ensure that Scotland is prepared to respond effectively to major emergencies. The Scottish Government and statutory responders have long acknowledged and valued the contribution to national resilience that is made by the wide range of bodies in the third sector, the private sector, and community groups which activate in response to emergency events. To support collective discussion around the all-risks approach to preparedness and response arrangements, the Scottish Government hosts regular meetings of the Voluntary Sector Resilience Partnership. This partnership brings these parties together to build connections, relationships, and an understanding of each other's capacity and capabilities to enable better planning and coordination around emergency response arrangements. In this way, and assisted by Scottish Government guidance contained in a series of documents entitled Preparing Scotland, Scottish Guidance on Resilience, which was published from 2016, organisations within Scotland are able to plan for emergencies at a local and regional level. This is, in fact, a simple and easily understood structure. It was within this structure that pandemic preparations were made. With mention of pandemic preparation, it may be useful for interested observers to know a little about the Scottish Government's preparation for a pandemic. The Scottish Government's approach to pandemic planning was guided by 3 things. Firstly, advice from scientists and experts from the UK and the World Health Organization. Secondly, by best practice. And thirdly, by prior experience. Preparations were, again, made at a national, regional and local level. Some preparations were also made at a Four Nations level. Thus, for example, the Scottish Government collaborated in the development of the UK influenza pandemic preparedness strategy from 2011, of which we have heard already. This document provided background information and gave guidance to organisations for developing plans. Further, close links existed and continue to exist between the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland and the Chief Medical Officer for the other nations, thereby allowing the exchange of information on pandemic risk. In addition, Scottish officials participated in a UK government-led Pandemic Readiness Flu Board. Turning to plans made at a Scottish national, regional and local level, the Scottish Risk Assessment, published in 2018, which we have also heard of, supplements the UK National Risk Assessment. It identified and analysed 10 actual risks facing Scotland, including pandemic influenza, which was identified as having a high likelihood of occurring. The risk assessment provided a means by which local and regional organisations could prepare and respond to the risks identified. In 2017, the Scottish Government established its own Pandemic Flu Preparedness Board, designed to drive forward particular aspects of pandemic preparation in Scotland, often on devolved matters. The Scottish Government participated in a UK-wide pandemic influenza exercise, Exercise Cygnus, in 2016. In 2015, it ran its own Scottish-wide pandemic influenza exercise called Exercise Silver Swan. And in 2018, Exercise Iris assessed NHS Scotland's response to a suspected outbreak of Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. The combined effect of these and other preparations was that across Scotland, the Scottish Government, together with organisations from health boards to local authorities, had in place influenza pandemic preparedness plans. Now, of course, it has to be recognised that such plans were not an exact match for a coronavirus pandemic. However, many of their features could be adapted, and the lessons learned while preparing for an influenza pandemic were of great benefit when responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. It should also be recognised that for much of this period, the Scottish Government had to make budgetary decisions within a climate of austerity and with many other competing demands on the public purse from across different policy areas of government and the Scottish Parliament. Further, in 2018 and 2019, pandemic preparations had to compete with preparations for a possible no-deal departure from the EU for the attention of experienced resilience personnel. Before leaving this topic, I should mention two measures that helped greatly with management of the pandemic. The first is the reform of public health structures. In April 2020, a series of reviews, co-led by the Scottish Government and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, or COSLA, culminated in the establishment of Public Health Scotland. And we heard first thing this morning from Mr. Bowie, who represents Public Health Scotland. This unique body brought under one roof responsibility for the collection of health-related data, the thinking to address society's health issues, and the making of improvements to the health system. Jointly accountable to the Scottish Government and COSLA, the result was a single authoritative source of information and advice, a one-stop shop, if you will, that public and private sector leaders could call upon. This was invaluable during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second measure that I should mention was a series of protocols for the management of public health incidents, including infectious diseases. First published in 2003 and updated thereafter, the management of public health incidents, guidance on the roles and responsibilities of NHS-led incident management teams contained information that NHS boards and local authorities could use when preparing for or in response to a public health or environmental event or incident. These were well-established protocols that were of great practical benefit during the pandemic. In summary, therefore, my lady, the Scottish Government has incrementally built on its pandemic resilience capability over many years. It has thought carefully about potential risks and is prepared to the best of its ability. But, of course, the devastating effect of the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that there are many lessons to be learned and improvements that can be made. The Scottish Government has already taken steps to address this, in part through the setting up of the Standing Committee on Pandemic Preparedness. This is an advisory group bringing together scientists and technical experts to advise the Scottish Government preparing for future risks from pandemics. Yet it is not only in the field of science where improvements can be made. The pandemic revealed in stark terms that a healthy and prepared nation is one where inequalities are not tolerated. The eradication of inequalities in health and social care and the building of a healthier Scotland has been a priority for the Scottish Government for several years now. The Christie Commission on the Future Delivery of Public Services from 2011, the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Act from 2014, and the Review of Public Health in Scotland, Strengthening the Functioning and Refocusing Action for a Healthier Scotland from 2015 are all evidence of the Scottish Government's commitment in this area. Yet more remains to be done. We would submit that the candour displayed in the witness statements which have been produced to the inquiry on behalf of the Scottish Government are testament to the Scottish Government's willingness to listen, to learn and to adapt. The Scottish Government is grateful to my lady for the opportunity to make this opening statement. It has been a necessarily brief and high-level overview of the resilience system in Scotland and the pandemic preparation that took place. We hope it has been of assistance to the inquiry, but we also hope that to those listening and watching the inquiry process, it has provided some insight into some areas that they may not have heretofore known about. My team and I hope that we can be of assistance to my lady and to her team in the weeks to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll break now. I shall return at 11:20.